My name is Eleanor Vance, and the last words my mother said to me before locking the door were, "You're worthless, just like we always knew." She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She said it like a fact, like something she'd been saving. I stood there with my suitcases, my name stripped from the family trust, and a lifetime of silence folded into my back pocket. What they didn't know, what none of them ever bothered to ask, was that just weeks earlier, my great-aunt, the one they all dismissed as senile, had left me her entire estate. Every building, every account, every forgotten share, and every quiet company. Now they're bankrupt. Their empire is collapsing. And the only investor willing to save them, me, the daughter they threw out like trash. Before we go further, tell me, have you ever been erased by your own family until they realized you were the one holding the key? If you have, you're not alone. This story is for you. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our growing family here at HP, Family Drama. Let's begin. I've always been the quiet one, the one who slipped out of family photos just a second too soon, the one they forgot to introduce at parties. The one whose name was barely whispered when bragging rights were passed around the country club bar. My brothers Mark and Samuel, they were the golden ones. Loud, confident, always chasing the next big thing. Dad called them visionaries. Mom said they had the family fire. They made risky investments, played with other people's money, and called it legacy building. And me, I cataloged old letters in the local library and restored newspaper clippings from the 1800s. I wrote footnotes in pencil and pressed wildflowers into archival paper. To them, that wasn't work. It was a hobby for the unambitious. I didn't protest. There's a quiet kind of power in being underestimated, but back then I didn't know how much it would hurt when even the people who raised me stopped pretending I mattered. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 48 years old. And I live in the only home I've ever felt safe, in my great-grandparents' house on Laurel Avenue. The floors creak in all the right places. The wallpaper in the upstairs hall still holds the faint smell of cedar and lavender. I've spent the last 12 years restoring it piece by piece. It isn't just a house, it's a record. A living archive of who we were before ambition swallowed everything. I thought that mattered. I thought if I cared enough, preserved enough, loved quietly and fully enough, they'd see me. But they didn't. The first signs came when Dad's firm started missing quarterly targets. Then came whispers of failed acquisitions, lawsuits, SEC interest. Mark flew in from Atlanta with new spreadsheets. Samuel called me late one night and asked, "Would you ever consider putting the house up as collateral just for a short-term loan?" I said no. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just said no. It was like I'd flipped a switch. Suddenly I was selfish. Suddenly I was ungrateful. Mom cried at the dinner table. Dad slammed his fist and said I was sabotaging the only thing this family ever built. And when I tried to explain, when I said this house was part of our real legacy, they laughed. Mark said, "You think some peeling wallpaper and dusty books matter more than the company that fed you?" Samuel said, "You were always the emotional one." And then they told me to leave. They didn't say it like a question. They said it like a sentence. Final. Cold. Done. The next morning, my childhood bedroom was empty. My boxes were stacked by the back door, and taped to the top was a note in Mom's handwriting. It read, "If you ever change your mind, we're still family. But only if I gave up the house. Only if I gave up what little I still had." I left with 3 suitcases and no keys, no forwarding address, no apology. And I would have disappeared into quiet places just like I always had if not for the letter that arrived 1 week later. It was from my great-aunt Lydia. She hadn't spoken to anyone in our family in over 2 decades. They called her eccentric, said she was reclusive, unstable, too sentimental. But Lydia always saw something in me. She used to mail me postcards from towns no one else could find on a map. She once told me, "You're the only one who remembers where we came from." That's a kind of strength they'll never understand. When the envelope arrived, it was thick, cream-colored, embossed. The return address read Vance and Leland Holdings, Legal Division, and inside was a letter from Lydia's lawyer. She had passed peacefully in her sleep, and she had left everything to me, not just her savings. The letter listed a property portfolio across 5 states, 3 functioning businesses, a controlling stake in a historical preservation fund, and a trust-stable conservative fully funded just in my name. I read the letter 3 times. Then I sat in the quiet kitchen of a rental apartment I couldn't afford and cried. Not because I was rich, but because for the first time in my life, someone had seen me. Someone had believed I was worth something without needing me to prove it first, and that was the beginning. The irony didn't hit me all at once. It came in pieces. A forwarded article about my father's company downsizing. A voicemail from an old neighbor asking if I'd heard that Samuel had sold his boat. A LinkedIn update about Mark transitioning to advisory roles. From the outside, the cracks looked small, but I recognized them for what they were. The empire was crumbling, and this time there was no soft landing. I watched it all from the quiet of a second-story study in one of Lydia's restored townhomes, a place she'd bought decades ago for its bones. I didn't say anything. I didn't reach out. But the silence didn't last. The first message came from my mother. Just 2 lines. "We need to talk, please. No apology. No explanation. Just need." Then came the calls. Voicemail after voicemail from Samuel. Messages from numbers I didn't recognize, lawyers, consultants, family friends I hadn't seen since I was 16. They all circled the same question: would I consider a short-term loan to help stabilize the family business? They didn't even realize it had already slipped out of their hands. The company they worshipped, Vance Equity, was under investigation for fraud, tax, misreporting, and misuse of retirement funds. Mark had pulled money from employee pensions to save a merger that fell through. Samuel had signed off on real estate deals they couldn't close. And my father, he'd quietly retired and buried the paperwork. They were desperate, cornered, tarnished, and I, the worthless daughter, was suddenly the last clean name the Vance family had left. One afternoon, a large envelope arrived, hand-delivered, no return address, inside a proposal, legal terms, clear language. They wanted me to invest in Vance Equity through a holding company. In exchange, I would get a minority stake and a public statement welcoming me back into the family business, as if a press release could erase decades of silence, as if a piece of paper could rewrite the years I spent invisible. I didn't respond. Instead, I took a walk. Charleston was hot that day, muggy, thick air, the kind that clings to your skin. I walked past the old cemetery where Lydia used to leave flowers, past the market square where I'd once sat alone during a family dinner I wasn't invited to, and when I came back I knew what I would do. I called a lawyer, not one of theirs, mine, a woman named Clarissa who specialized in acquisitions and anonymity. "I don't want them to know it's me," I said calmly. "Not yet. Not until I decide they should." She paused, then replied, "That's easier than you think." Within a week, Clarissa created a holding company in Delaware. Neutral name. Neutral front. From there, she began buying up Vance Equity debt. Quietly, legally, strategically. By the time my family realized their largest creditor was a single entity, it was already too late. I watched them scramble. My mother posted family photos for the first time in years, suddenly including old snapshots of me smiling stiffly in hand-me-down dresses. Samuel called crying one night. He said he missed me. Said things had gotten blown out of proportion. I listened. I didn't speak. He said he wanted to apologize in person. I let the line go quiet. Then I hung up. The truth was they didn't miss me. They missed the idea of me. The obedient daughter. The emotional sister, the soft one they could bend. But that version of me no longer existed. And still, despite everything, I didn't want revenge. Not really. I didn't want to ruin them. I just wanted them to see. To really see. That the girl they called invisible was the only one who had never lied, the only one who had stayed clean, the only one who remembered what legacy was supposed to mean. So when Clarissa told me we had the opportunity to make an offer, not to lend money but to buy them out entirely, I didn't hesitate. We submitted the offer through the holding company. It was generous, fair, merciful even. Their board voted. They accepted. And within 48 hours, I became the majority owner of Vance Equity. They didn't know, not yet. But the moment was coming. The contracts were signed, the transfers completed, the press release scheduled, and the meeting, the one where the new ownership would be announced, was already on the calendar. They were about to learn the name behind the holding company, and when they did, when they saw me walk into that boardroom, every word they'd ever spoken about my worth would echo in their silence. The boardroom looked exactly how I remembered it: cold, glass-walled, a long mahogany table polished to a shine that reflected every ceiling light. It used to intimidate me, not anymore. I stepped in just as the clock struck 10. Every chair was filled board members, legal advisors, even a few old family friends trying to cling to relevance. And then I saw them. My mother seated at the far end, Mark scrolling nervously through his phone, Samuel pale and sweating, flipping through a stapled report like he didn't already know what it said. Their faces didn't change. Not at first. Maybe they thought I was someone's assistant, a paralegal, an auditor, until I took the seat at the head of the table and said calmly, "Let's begin." Mark blinked. Samuel frowned. My mother tilted her head just slightly. "I'm sorry, who exactly are you representing?" Mark asked, voice tight. I opened the folder in front of me, slid a copy down the table. The logo on the corner read Laurel Trust Holdings, the shell company Clarissa and I had built. "I represent the majority shareholder," I said evenly. "And as of 48 hours ago, that's me." Silence. You could hear the air shift. A pen dropped somewhere near the end of the table. Someone cleared their throat. My mother's voice was the first to break. "Eleanor." It wasn't warm. It wasn't even confused. It was accusatory, like I'd shown up to a party I wasn't invited to. "You're the one behind Laurel Trust?" she asked. I met her eyes. "Yes." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." I didn't answer. Samuel leaned forward, his hands trembling. "This isn't legal. There's no way. How did you even—" "The board approved the acquisition unanimously," I said. "You signed the paperwork, Samuel? Page 6, line 23. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. And then my mother spoke again, but her voice was quieter now, measured. "Why, Eleanor? Why would you do this to us?" I let the silence stretch. "Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. Because you taught me something," I said softly. "You taught me that silence is survival, that if I didn't speak up, if I didn't fight back, you'd erase me completely." Her lips parted, but I kept going. "You called me worthless. You locked me out of my own home. You told me the only way I could belong again was to give up the only thing that had ever truly belonged to me." I turned to Mark. "You mocked me for staying behind, for caring about something other than profit margins." Then to Samuel. "You asked for my help, then turned me into the villain when I said no. No one spoke, no one moved, and so I finished it. I didn't buy this company to punish you. I bought it to protect what's left of our name." I pushed the final folder across the table. "In 6 months, Vance Equity will transition into a preservation fund. We'll be dissolving high-risk holdings, returning what we can to our creditors, and redirecting our assets to community redevelopment." Samuel's eyes widened. "You're dismantling it. You're tearing it all down." "No," I said. "I'm salvaging what matters." Mark stood, jaw clenched. "This is personal. You're doing this because we hurt your feelings." I looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like their little sister in the shadows. I felt certain. "No," I said again. "I'm doing this because you forgot what this was supposed to be. And I didn't." Mark's voice cracked. "This was our legacy." I stood too. "No. This was your weapon. Your shield, your excuse to make people feel small while you played gods in tailored suits." My mother didn't stand. She just sat there, hands folded, as if she were bracing herself for a storm that had already arrived. "I was never the weak one," I said quietly. And then I walked out. No drama, no raised voice, no gloating, just the soft click of the door behind me. They didn't follow. They couldn't. Because this wasn't a negotiation anymore. It wasn't even revenge. It was the end. And they knew it. I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no victory toast, no dramatic press conference. Just me sitting at the corner desk in Lydia's old study, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan and the soft tick of the grandfather clock. That's the thing about reclaiming power. It doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it's just quiet, measured, unshakable. The next morning I made 3 calls. The first was to Clarissa. "I'm ready," I said. "Let's start the restructuring." She didn't ask what I meant. She already knew. We moved quickly. The first step was removing the noise. The brand name Vance Equity was too stained to salvage. We dissolved it quietly under the umbrella of the Lydia Vance Foundation for Historical Futures. It sounded elegant, non-threatening, but beneath it was a machine lean, clean, and surgically precise. All high-risk portfolios were frozen, luxury assets were flagged for liquidation, and most critically, we issued full refunds to all clients who had been misled by false projections. Some board members resigned on the spot. Others tried to rally. But I'd done my homework. The bylaws they'd once written to protect their control were now the very tools I used to dismantle it. They'd never expected someone like me to read the fine print, but I'd spent 20 years reading things no one else noticed. Quiet pays attention. My second call was to Miss Alston, the director of the Charleston Public Archive. She sounded startled to hear from me. "I thought you'd gone quiet," she said softly. "I was watching," I replied, "but now I want to build." I offered a partnership. The Lydia Vance Foundation would fund a new digital preservation initiative focusing on marginalized local histories, disappearing communities, endangered landmarks. No red tape, no politics, I said, just stories. Saved. She cried, and I did too. A little. My third call was the hardest. I dialed it slowly, stared at the screen for almost a full minute before pressing send. The call went to voicemail. It was my father's number. I hadn't heard his voice since the day I was kicked out, but I left the message anyway. "Hi," I said softly. "I'm not calling for forgiveness or closure. I just thought you should know. I'm doing something with our name, something real." I paused, then added, "You were wrong about me, but I'm not angry anymore, just free." Click. I ended the call. From there, the work began. We converted the family's old headquarters into a mixed-use co-op, part community workspace, part preservation center, part museum. I hired archivists, grant writers, young researchers, many of them local women who'd never been given a seat at the table. I let them build the table from scratch. At first, people were skeptical. Why would a former finance firm turn to history? But that was the point. Money fades. But memory, if you care for it, it lives. We launched our first public exhibit that fall, Southern Futures: Unwritten Histories of Charleston. Hundreds came, teachers, students, a few hesitant board members in stiff suits, even a local journalist who once wrote an op-ed calling me a footnote in her family's legacy. He asked for an interview. I said no, because this wasn't about press. It was about peace. Meanwhile, the fallout came quietly. As I'd expected, Mark moved to Texas to rebrand. Samuel filed for bankruptcy. My mother stayed in Charleston. She never called. But one day a letter arrived. No return address, no salutation, just 5 words. I walked past the museum. That was it. But it was enough. I didn't write back, because some bridges don't burn, they sink, and sometimes that's mercy. Months passed, seasons changed. And I, the daughter once called worthless, now oversaw over a dozen preservation grants, 3 active redevelopment sites, and a scholarship fund for young women studying archival science. No gala, no headlines, just good work, quiet work, enduring work. And that to me was power. Not revenge, not dominance, but direction. One evening I stood on the porch of the Laurel Avenue house. The sky was gold, the wind was warm. I looked up at the shutters I had restored with my own hands, painted with care, framed with memory. Behind me, the lights inside flickered on steady soft. Inside, someone was scanning old letters for our next exhibit. 2 volunteers were cataloging oral histories from the West End. Downstairs, a young girl barely 20 was learning how to handle first edition pages without damaging their spines. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about what my family had taken. It was about what I'd built because they didn't believe I could. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't need them to see me. Because I saw myself. Finally. Fully. And that was enough. It's been 2 years since that day. The day I closed the door and didn't look back. The foundation is thriving. We've restored 4 historic landmarks, digitized over 10,000 family records, and launched a scholarship fund for young women in archival science. Last month, a girl named Tasha, barely 21, stood on the porch of our main center and said, "This place feels like it was built by someone who understands what it's like to be overlooked." I didn't tell her the whole story, just smiled, because I did understand. Deeply. And maybe that's why it worked. Not in spite of being forgotten, but because of it. When you've been invisible long enough, you learn to see what others miss. The corners. The cracks. The soft places people forget to protect. That's where legacy lives, not in glass towers or company logos, but in the quiet acts of care no one applauds. I don't speak to my family anymore. Not out of bitterness, out of choice. There are some silences that don't need to be filled, only honored. I hear from others sometimes. A cousin sent a wedding invitation. I sent a donation to their local history fund instead. Mark opened a consulting firm in Houston. Samuel remarried quietly. My mother moved to a smaller house near the coast. She volunteers at a garden club. That feels fitting somehow. I don't wish them harm, but I don't wish myself back into their story either, because I have my own now. One I wrote, one I restored, and one I'll pass on to people who truly see its value. The house on Laurel Avenue is still mine, but it's more than a house now. It's a place where lost things are found again, where worthless daughters become stewards of memory, where the quiet ones finally get to speak. Sometimes when the light hits just right, I walk past the upstairs hall mirror and catch my own reflection. Not small, not soft, not forgotten, just whole. Finally. And if there's one thing I know now, it's this: your worth was never theirs to define. They can mock it, dismiss it, walk away from it, but they cannot erase it. Not if you keep building, even if it starts with just you. Even if you're the only one who believes it's possible, because one day someone will walk through the doors of the life you built and say, "This place feels like it was made for people like me," and they'll be right.